Episode 2 of this series will be a review of the historical evidence of disabilities in the ancient world through the case study of 3 very different societies of that time period. I will attempt to shed some light on the lives of the disabled that lived within them and those societies' vastly varying cultures that influenced their perspective on disability. When exactly ancient history starts and ends is widely disputed. However, to keep it simple, I will be using the most commonly used dates to define this period, which is from the creation of the written word in roughly 3000 BCE and ending at the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 ACE. I hope you enjoyed the following presentation. While researching disability in ancient Greece, I have discovered that there was not one prevailing school of thought to treatment of the disabled. Rather, there was a mixture of social, cultural, and religious influences that resulted in seemingly conflicting attitudes that coexisted. For example, infanticide was commonplace with those born suffering from congenital illness across all of ancient Greece, while at the same time the disabled received assistance in a crude form of social welfare from the Athenian state. The disabled were mocked by such playwrights as Aristophanes, while simultaneously some of the greatest ancient Greek writers had severe disabilities. So, although the picture of social attitudes towards disabilities in ancient Greece was complex and at times paradoxical, I will do my best to provide a snapshot of this society and the convoluted nature of their relationship with disability. Ancient Greek cities were inhabited by people with a wide range of visible physical disabilities. Some disabilities were congenital, while others were acquired through warfare, accident, or disease. Their participation in economic activities was viewed as commonplace. There were lame slaves, tailors who limped, people with withered arms who used saws and spades, lame peddlers, and injured metal workers or miners. Although it seems most physical disability was accepted in the adults of ancient Greece, this was not the case for the mute. The ancient Greeks equated the inability to speak with an inability to reason. So mute people were considered stupid. Muteness is the pinnacle of divine punishment for terrible acts. Hesiod, in his Theogony, tells us that treacherous gods were punished by being forced to lie for 1 year without a voice. Speechlessness was also an appropriate curse aimed at your political opponents or those who were simply annoying. Many curse tablets request that someone be afflicted with muteness. Blindness was perhaps the most common disability in ancient Greece. Cataract and glaucoma were probably as prevalent back then as they are today. nutritional deficiencies were also to blame. Many people also lost their sight as a result of accidents. Masons, miners, and smiths often suffer grievous eye injuries. As with muteness, the loss of eyesight could be considered a divine punishment. However, unlike muteness, blindness was no obstacle to a successful career. Homer was blind. Eratosthenes, a mathematician and geographer who calculated the circumference of the earth and became the chief librarian of the Library of Alexandria, had dulling vision. Blindness was not even an obstacle at war. In warfare, hand-to-hand combat was obviously out of the question, but blind Athenians were able to row a trireme. The world of disability in ancient Greece incorporated a wide range of experiences. Each case was dealt with according to its particular circumstances. Some people with physical impairments were ridiculed, while others considered the teachers of Greece. Men and women with disabilities were integrated into their communities and contributed to the best of their abilities. Perhaps there is no finer expression of ancient Greek attitudes towards disabilities than the inclusion of the disabled god Hephaestus to their pantheon. Hephaestus, the god of metalworking, artisans, and fire, was shriveled of foot. His life mirrors many of the daily experiences of mortals with disabilities. He was actively engaged in artisanal endeavors and had no trouble securing Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, as a consort. Plutarch accounts for the god's association with fire by claiming that fire makes no progress without wood, and neither do the disabled people without a cane. Despite his physical deformity, Hephaestus took his place among the other gods in the feast hall on Mount Olympus. He just had to ride a donkey to get there. Endemic warfare created a vast number of more or less seriously disabled people who had suffered injury in battle. These joined the large number of individuals who suffered from congenital conditions or who had been crippled by disease later in life. Furthermore, Chinese traditional law called for the use of mutilation punishments, whereby a wide range of different types of injury were inflicted upon convicted criminals. Such punishments, which included amputation of the feet or the ears, cutting off the kneecaps and so on, created a highly stigmatized group of disabled people whose injuries were a constant visible reminder of their criminal past. No account of the treatment of the disabled in ancient China can be complete without consideration of the way in which crippling injuries and criminality intersect in the public mind. Attitudes towards what constituted a disability varied enormously in ancient China. Within mainstream Chinese culture, which developed along the Yellow River, definitions of disability were profoundly affected by the importance accorded to filial piety. which can be defined as the duty of every child to maintain their body undamaged as an expression of gratitude towards their father and mother for the gift of life. Confucian classics and other ancient Chinese canonical texts frequently emphasized the link between physical perfection and moral integrity. This was balanced in wider philosophical discourse by alternative interpretations. Taoist philosophers in particular were skeptical of any claims that physical beauty was linked to virtue. Furthermore, they enjoyed pointing out that since disabled persons in ancient China were excused from both military service and labor, it was the able-bodied who suffered lasting damage from the corrupt policies of their governments. A number of ancient philosophical texts discuss different aspects of social attitudes towards the disabled in early China. It is clear that certain groups of the disabled were able to attain positions of some prestige. The government classified a small number of disability types, as well as those with dwarfism, as talents for government service, and such individuals were actively recruited for the court. Beyond that small number of disability types, many disabled people, particularly those with some kind of congenital malformation, were the subject of considerable humiliating attention from others. And this seems to have been the case regardless of their social background. At a very early stage in Chinese history, it was noticed that stressed populations suffering from the effects of constant warfare and upheaval had a higher incidence of babies being born with congenital deformities. It was also well understood that stressed populations had a higher rate of disease, if not to crippling ill health. Furthermore, the social dislocation caused by warfare was clearly linked to the breaking down of law and order. And increasingly desperate people resorted to criminal activities in order to survive. In the Chinese context, this would lead directly to mutilation punishments, as the law did not take into account the circumstance which had pushed the individual into crime in the first place. As a result of this strong association between war and disability, established on so many different fronts, ancient Chinese philosophers regularly express a belief that in a perfect world, there would be no disabled people. In an era of peace, there will be no one who is mute, deaf, lame, blind, crippled, dwarfish, or lacking their limbs. Fathers will not cry for their sons. Older brothers will not have to cry for their young siblings. Given this muddled understanding of disability and the negative connotations they related it to, the belief that in a perfect world there would be no disabled people born and none created, the presence of these individuals within ancient Chinese society was a permanent reminder of the failures of the regime. Irregardless of whether their disability was the result of criminal punishment, a wartime injury, or congenital in nature, the able-bodied of China viewed all disabled people as a constant reminder of the brutality of war, social and economic injustice, and the inability of their government to deal with these intractable problems. In ancient Egypt, physical disabilities or body deformities were considered divine attributes granted to humans by the gods. This was expressed in representing certain gods with misshapen bodies or dwarfism. The ancient Egyptian tolerance for disabled appeared, as well as in having little people and other malformed persons among the household of the kings and high officials. Ancient Egyptian moral instructions stressed respect for people with disabilities, as in the teachings of Amenemhotep: beware of robbing a wretch or attacking a cripple. Do not laugh at the blind man, nor tease a dwarf, nor cause hardship for the lame. Don't tease a man who is in the hand of the god. Dwarfism is probably the most commonly depicted human physical disorder in ancient Egyptian art. Those with dwarfism were commonly depicted in their work field alongside fully grown men. Several high-ranking little people, especially from the Old Kingdom, achieved important status. Their costly tombs in the royal cemeteries indicated their high position in the ancient society and their close relation to the king as well. Egyptians and Greeks both believed that the human body was designed in the god's own images. However, with the exception of the lame Hephaestus, the Greeks attributed physical perfection to all of their deities. However, the Egyptian pantheon did not demonstrate a similar uniform perfection and included examples of otherness, encompassing not only gods with perfect human physiques and their animal variations, but also gods with dwarfism and deities who had suffered and overcome physical injuries. The most important dwarf gods, Bez and Fa, were associated with solar worship, fertility, birth, sleep, music, entertainment, protection of the dead, women, and children. The fact that dwarf deities held such important roles may have encouraged people to accept and even celebrate deformity. Some Bez figures also display features such as a protruding tongue, which may indicate other complex birth anomalies. Egyptian attitudes to death and the afterlife undoubtedly influenced their perception of physical anomalies. They were probably more willing to accept and tolerate deformity and disability because of their belief that no one could achieve perfection in this world. This state was only attainable after death, when a life of piety, divine worship, and good deeds, followed by correct burial procedures, guaranteed a person's rebirth into the kingdom of Osiris. god of the dead. In antiquity, enough people with physical anomalies survived to force their communities to consider and address issues associated with deformity and disability. Some societies found religious reasons to reject the deformed and disabled. However, the Egyptians had no religious context for stigmatizing those with physical anomalies. On the contrary, the Egyptians readily integrated the disabled into their society and developed effective responses to meet many of their practical needs. Before I continue, I first need to do a huge shout out to Christian Layers, the author of Disability in Antiquity. This was a fantastic read and was the primary source for most of the information shared in this video. I wish I had the time to share more of the interesting contents of this book. I would 100% recommend this book to any history buffs wanting to learn more about disability in ancient history. Blind kings, limping women, crippled tradesmen, and lame gods. The ancient world was coloured with disability, and the tales of the disabled who not only survived but thrived in it. From artisans and mothers to kings and even deities, the disabled were not a marginalized sector of society, but part of its very lifeblood. Since then, disability has become an ever-diminishing occurrence within our society, thanks to medical advances. But it will always have a presence in the human story. By taking notice of how other cultures and historical eras perceived and integrated disability into their everyday lives, perhaps the West can begin to understand disability not as a binary opposite to perceived normality, but rather as part and parcel of human existence, much as the ancients did. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.